personally, I find it difficult to say the same thing again and again. But this hasn't been difficult because I'm really angry about this project. So anger is a huge motivator and it kind of keeps you going. And the reason that I'm angry is because it seems to me like this is the huge marketing con job of the century. And many of us have, in fact, walked into it quite unaware of the implications of a project like this. I also recognize when I was coming here, I was thinking, where do I begin? Because it's, what I've been saying over the past 3-4 years, things are changing so fast. It's like every day we find ourselves being database somewhere, being data mined somewhere else, being profiled somewhere else. And we don't even know it. It's happening every day. There are multiple ways in which this is happening. And one of the huge things, it's like a motto that's come out of this is that the poor have no interest in privacy and privacy is dead. So the question could be, is privacy really dead? Or do we need to let it die? Or do we care about it at all? Because we keep getting told that after the advent of the age of technology, nobody really cares about privacy. So, you're like one fossil who's sitting there and talking about privacy. Nobody really cares. And that has kind of sent me into, and a number of others in India now, over the years, the numbers have been growing, into trying to understand what is this that we are calling privacy. Is it really just about my neighbor peering in through the window and seeing what kind of a life I'm leading, or is it something different? And is it really impossible in an age of technology to have no privacy at all? And should that be the way we go? Is that where we want to go? So that's kind of the background to where we are on thinking about the project today. But I'll just go back a bit because I find that this unique identification project in India is an experiment on a whole population. Essentially, that's what it is. It's not just an experiment with technology. It is an experiment with technology, but it's not just that. It's an experiment to see how far whoever is interested in this is able to push the boundaries of control without it even being noticed as being control. It's about corporations and governments working together and having common interests and supporting each other through this process where the ordinary mass of people just become subjects of these two entities. In the Indian context, we also recognize that it's been the one huge marketing exercise, which is not meant to just sell this idea to India, but it's meant to sell it to the world beyond. And we got a little glimmer of this when early in the project we found that there was a MOU, a kind of MOU that existed between the World Bank and L1 Identity Solutions, which is one of the biometric providers, where they'd said that, go forth. The World Bank was telling them, go into all these developing countries and help in delivering services through the use of biometrics. Just go out and multiply. So it was a very, and we've seen that it is in fact the birth of a new religion. It's a new faith that all of us have to have. We have to have faith in this project, in this technology. There are many similarities to the way in which we were taught to think about God when we were kids, where they say, God can see you wherever you are. So, do no wrong. Yeah. And when you make mistakes, God will know you've made your mistakes. And when God is making mistakes in relation to you, it's actually not a mistake. They're just testing you. So the technology is never wrong. Technology is never wrong. Technology cannot be seen, but it can see you all the time. And you must have faith. Why would you want to question technology? What wrong can technology do? Technology is neutral. When we were saying this, there was a kid at home, and I mean, this is a bit of an aside, but it does make sense to us, who said, they were all there. So there was all this discussion about God and technology and whatever. And then suddenly this kid pipes up and says, I actually think God is a scientist and human beings were an experiment. We are a failed experiment, so the scientist has moved on. But we still think that God is around and that our life is carrying on with God being there. So I'm tempted to think, when I think of this project, that these technology creators, manufacturers, providers, marketers have taken the place of that God in a sense, because it's completely replacing everything else. What seems to have also happened is that because many of us use many of these modes of technology and have found, like the Arab Spring, it's something we talk about all the time, and the use of technology in the Arab Spring and what help it provided to people on the ground. It seems like, it's something that we are hooked onto, and we can't see it as being wrong or bad because it's helped us. And because we've adopted so many of these things, you must have seen recently, Google has filed an affidavit in court saying that since we do our emailing and all the stuff through them, they are entitled to read anything that they want, and privacy simply doesn't come into the picture. So it's an extreme position they are taking. I'm sure they'll mold it over time to make it seem more reasonable, but this is the long and short of it. That there are many people who think that they have right and claim to our identities, to our persons, and to our biographies. The only good thing about the internet is that it provides this kind of biography, which saves us. I think it's the one saving grace of the internet, that it's often wrong. And maybe that's where we need to protect ourselves. We also know that the other kinds of that there is a linking up of multiple technologies. For instance, you have the internet, and then you have biometrics, and then the mobile phone technology, and these work very well together. When they work together, they're able to see anybody at any point in time, where they are and what possibly they are doing. Apart from privacy, the other thing that we are often told is, why does it matter if people know? How does it matter? If you don't do any wrong, why should you be why should we be afraid of this? And if you do wrong, then maybe you do need to be monitored. Maybe you need to be pulled in. So what's the big deal about this? Of course, I must say this is a personal position. I do not intend to live doing no wrong. I intend to do wrong. I enjoy my wrong and my wrongdoing. It's a different thing that, and as a lawyer, I know that the difference between wrong and crime is huge. There's a huge gap between wrong and crime. Every wrong, which may be a moral wrong or a whatever wrong, doesn't automatically translate into a legal offense. So there are many ways in which difference is respected. And that difference often comes out as wrong. I think a number of movements that we've had in the past 30, 40 years tells us that there are many ways in which we deviate. And every deviation is treated as deviance for a very long time till it gets accepted. And by then, it's no longer wrong. But of course, in the Indian context, we've seen, for instance, that we had a High Court striking down a provision on homosexuality and a Supreme Court bringing it back. They struck down what the High Court said. So it can be wrong today, not wrong tomorrow, and then wrong again the day after. The idea of not doing any wrong, therefore, is really narrow and extremely limited. Also, that there are many things that we don't want everybody to know. Privacy is not. Privacy is also about relationships. It's about power equations. It's when the state knows me, or when a corporation knows me, it's very different from my neighbor knowing me. And I protect myself from even my neighbor and from someone within the home. So what happens when a state is going to have a panopticon view of who I am, which may be accurate sometimes and inaccurate at others, but when they're able to map our lives across time. So just to give you one thing on the unique identification project, they start with saying that the number that they're going to produce is going to be a number that they don't have to repeat over centuries, because they don't intend. We die, the number will never die. It's like another kind of immortality. So, we can all stop fearing death, because we will never really die. It's fine. The the project started in an odd kind of way, and it's plain, therefore, that it was not just an Indian project. That much is clear. I don't think there is any doubt in our minds that this was not just it's not an Indian project in the sense it's not like something that was started saying, all right, we need to make safety pins here and let's find the technology with which to make it. And, because Indians need more safety pins today than the rest of the world, so we're finding our own technology. It wasn't like that. We had an earlier, I think across the world now, states are asking for national identity cards. And we had a person from World Bank who had come in from one of our meetings, and he said, 40% of Indians are illegal. Yeah, I said, meaning what? So he said, they don't have any IDs. So I said, so if you don't have an ID, you're illegal? And he said, yeah, I mean, how do you establish your legality? I said, no, you have to establish my illegality. So it's a completely distorted vision of who belongs and who's an outsider, who gets included and who gets excluded, who is legal, who is illegal. And I find that this is one battle where, for a lot of human rights work, we go to Europe to help us with the kind of thinking that they've done. And we say, oh, well, Europe is doing it. Can't you advance? Like, I know the death penalty, we keep saying, it's part of their policy that they won't even allow a country to come in and be part of EU, so long as you retain the death penalty. So then we use that a little bit to say that, is there some kind of moral, ethical basis? Is there some kind of state logic in why you don't have the death penalty? On ID cards, unfortunately, they're like, it's proliferated everywhere. Not biometric IDs, but the idea of a national ID has proliferated everywhere. Now, in a place like India, and I think that applies for many parts of the developing world today, the IDs are not that simple a proposition. They say, okay, when you're born, you're going to be given an ID, and it will be the same ID till you die. But actually, people, the changes that are happening in people's lives and the way in which they are able to establish and re-establish their identities, it's extremely complex in situations like this. So xenophobia, of course, has left very few countries untouched. So we have, it's one of those strange things in India where you have Pakistan and Bangladesh, which are seen as having been part of the greater India at one time, the complete India at one time. But now, these are the countries from where if people come in, they are seen as a threat to the country. So if Pakistanis come in, I can understand, infiltrators who come in for terror activities being seen as a threat, but that's not even an issue now. In fact, it started in 1999 when there was a standoff at the India-Pakistan border after a case of infiltration, and about 500 people died in that prolonged eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation. And there was a failure of intelligence, plainly. There was a committee that was set up after that to figure out what had happened in terms of failure of intelligence. This is in 99. That committee suggested that maybe just along the borders, you could give people ID cards so that if they needed to quickly establish who they were, just to make sure that this is not some infiltrator, you could use this. Now that then got expanded into maybe coastal regions too could be included, and then they said you can also take it into the hinterland. By 2003, the logic of this ID card had changed. And they were no longer talking about infiltration from Pakistan, they were talking about illegal migration from Bangladesh, which is an economic problem. So the solution was the same for everything. Just give everybody an ID card, put them onto databases, and then you can track them. And you'll know who is good, who's bad, who's legal, who's illegal, whatever. You'll have the whole thing before you. The complexity of citizenship is not recognized at all in this. I know you have multiple issues going on in the US in relation to immigration and citizenship and whatever. And you know how complex it is. It's even more complex when you have the same, where you really can't distinguish between the population of one country and another. And to allow for a bureaucracy to decide whether a person is Indian or not, whether they are citizens or not, you should, if some of you have time, you should just look at the Indian Citizenship Act and the amendment that was made in 2003 and the rules that were made under it. So under the rules, they say that they're going to list everybody onto this database. And then they're going to put out these lists in local areas for what? For some kind of a poll from local people that they can come and figure out whether all the names there are citizens according to them or not. So people can come in, object. And then there will be one district level authority, one local authority and one district level authority. That's the appeal. That's the first stage of the appellate stage. They'll decide whether you're a citizen or not. So when they come in to take your information in the beginning, they'll ask questions. And if they feel that maybe you're not a citizen, you'll be put in a separate list and then you'll be checked. And this is the process that's being deployed. Over the past 60 years, we've learned that it's extremely complex to figure out who is a citizen. For instance, when the Bangladesh war happened, we had a number of people who came into India, and India hosted them and gave them a permanent status and overtime citizenship. Now to go back and say, oh, well, but I don't really like history very much, so let me just destroy history, obviously won't work. So the one thing that was clear to us when this project started was that this had nothing to do with citizenship, because you cannot determine citizenship through this process. And it had very little to do with security, because this is not going to produce security. And I mean, I can explain why when we go along. What then is it for? Why did a project like this come up? And we find that around 2004, there were multiple discussions apparently that were happening, which I was not party to at all then, because I had no idea that this was such a big issue. But there were discussions, say, among free software people, which the corporates came and had with them, about creation of many kinds of databases. So between 2004 and 2009, we find the idea of databasing people and databasing information which will relate to various people becoming the big thing. It was slow in evolving, but the idea was everyone should be on a database and all information should be on a database. So in 2009-10, you had one of the persons who was an advisor on technology to the government of India, who said something that was deeply honest. I don't know if he would have been encouraged to be as honest if they had realized what he was saying. But he said that, these are exciting times for India, and you're going to have the GPS, the GIS will map every resource. The public information infrastructure that was being created would map every institution and organization. And the UID, which is a unique identification project, would map every person, every individual. He said, once you have these three mapped, you have the country covered. Then you can deal with development. You can, all these are within inverted commas, of course, what constitutes development. You can deal with terrorism. You can deal with anything, because you've got all these mapped. Well, maybe you can't deal with terror, but you can certainly deal with militancy on the ground when there are protests, for instance, saying that don't take this resource away from us. So it was like an honest statement by a technocrat who said that what we are attempting to do is to map all of you. That's what we want. And we will map the resources, we'll map the institutions, and we'll map the people. So when the project came in 2009, actually in 2000, they'd been, since 2006, the talk had veered to reduction of subsidies. So ever since liberalization started, and ever since they stepped in and said, you've got to tighten your belt, and so whose belt do you tighten? You tighten the belt of those who don't have a waist at all. So it's like, people who don't have anything to eat, you tell them, yeah, if you don't have food, we can't do anything about it. You work, because if you're poor, you're responsible for your poverty. You want to get out of poverty? Work. Like work simply exists. Yeah. So we have, in fact, a population that is severely underskilled to perform many of the tasks which are becoming available. And we hardly have a manufacturing sector. And the growth is happening without generating any employment. So in this, we are telling people that you take care of yourselves, and we are going to pull back on subsidies. Of course, this too, unfortunately, we find that somewhere all this, either as an articulator or as a generator of these ideas, we find it goes back to the World Bank and whoever is initiating this kind of stuff in the World Bank. So they are our constant punching bags. We don't seem to be able to hurt them very much, but we don't stop punching anyway, because they are there at the center of all of this. And for a long time, we wondered if it was a bank that was created for reconstruction after a war. Why do they continue now? Except that, they've been generated, not they've been, but there have been wars forever after, and therefore they're going to keep reconstructing, or what? Because they seem to be in the process of destroying again before we can think of finding some way of reconstructing our lives. So this idea that you pull back on subsidies has been very strong coming from the World Bank. And one of the ridiculous things is where the Planning Commission of India asks the World Bank to produce a report for it on what it needs to do in relation to subsidies. And then we say, oh, you know what? The World Bank has told us that if we were to use this biometric identity and we were able to track every person who's getting these benefits, because it's all about benefit fraud. So we need to be able to control benefit fraud. And that's the reason that we need to have this identity. So, it's like whatever problem you have, the solution lies in databasing people, giving them a biometric identity, and tracking their activities. So this is one phase. So in 2006, when the Planning Commission started talking about creating some means by which they could target subsidies, they thought about multiple things, and by 2008 they said, okay, what we will do is this, that government has multiple databases. It provides work somewhere, it gives a voter ID somewhere, food in some other capacity, it gives education in some other capacity. So they said, we need to have some standardization of all these databases so that government at least will be able to see who the people are and then be able to deliver more efficiently. So like somebody told us, and that told us how government functions, they told us, it's terrible because these days, there are people who have a Benz car, which is like a big deal there. Huh? So if you have a Benz car, who are standing and getting rations from the public distribution system. This is atrocious. It's meant for the poor. And I was thinking a system that can't see a Benz car and recognize it, but needs to database people so that you know that the person who has a Benz car is coming to take rations from there's something really wrong with that system. It's not going to function, never mind what tools you give it. So in 2008, they finally said, all right, we'll set this Unique Identification Authority of India. We'll set this up. And this will not, it was categorical, this will not create any new database. What it will do is to standardize the databases that already exist in government so that government will be able to look at the various services that it's providing to people and target it better. This was how they started. There are problems with that too, because one of the protections that we have as people is that the information that we give to different agencies is held in silos. It's that you don't breach these silos. In any event, this project was not given the authority to create a new database. In 2009, in January, when they were issued a notification and on the basis of an executive notification, they started the project, did not ask them to create a database. They said, you will make a database out of what exists, and then that's where you see all the games begin. This is the first time that you see, I don't know how it works in other places, but the first time that you see a government project that says that the UID, which is the agency set up under this, will maintain and own the database. Now, this notification, in law, we keep saying that for inner morality of law, people need to know what the law is. If you don't know what the law is, how are you going to either follow it or, if you don't even know what the law is? The notification was very different. We didn't even know it existed for a long time. We tried getting it. It took a lot of effort before we managed to get hold of that notification. So for a long time, we didn't know that the UID was going to own the database. Now, all the information that we give to a government, the government holds in a fiduciary capacity. It is a custodian of that information, but it does not own that information. There's a huge difference. And the first time our antenna went, buzzing was when we found that they were saying that they own the database. Then in July of 2009, we saw the first open statement about corporate entity entry into government. So you had a head honcho, he was like a soft, technology marketing person who was pulled well, he kind of left there and he walked into this job of being the head of the UID. And he was given the status of a cabinet minister, which meant that he had the status and the privileges and the access that a cabinet minister would have, but not the answerability. Because when you have to be a cabinet minister, you have to win an election and get into parliament. If you don't get into parliament within 6 months of being appointed a minister, then you stop being a minister. So here they gave him the rank of a minister, but without the responsibility of a minister. So there was no answerability at all. And that has proved significant over time because there is no place where we can make him answer our questions. He's not there in parliament. It's always somebody else who knows very little about the project who's answering what the project is about. Yet he has access to every meeting. So it's what happened during that period, the moment he came in. It's also important to recognize that there is a corporatization of the state that is happening. It's not only by the relationship between the state and the corporations. It's also by the corporation, by the state itself being dominated by persons with a greater corporate background than, for instance, the prime minister that we had before this one. Manmohan Singh was the only people he was comfortable with were the corporates. His economics worked like corporate economics. And I've been for a meeting, for instance, with the Bhopal victims to meet him. And you could see that the physical discomfort at the proximity to people who are victims of some. And the only thing he told us at that meeting was after when we reached the third point, he said, you ask for anything you want clean water, I'll give you, you want whatever, just don't say anything about Dow Chemicals. They need to come, they're going to produce 3,000 jobs for us. And the victims were saying, well, they've actually produced, they're sheltering a Union Carbide corporation, which has already killed 20,000 people. So what is this 3,000 jobs you're talking about? But there was no question of a conversation on that. So there has been a corporatization that's happened within government itself. And that's something that many bureaucracies are, the bureaucracy and many bureaucrats are comfortable with, which has already created a distance between persons within the establishment and local populations. This is also a period where states have, where the state itself has become a contracting party with companies. So we have, for instance, MOUs into which the government enters, where the government and corporations are entering into an MOU, where the government is making many promises to the company, saying, for instance, that they will help them get environment clearances quickly, they'll help them get forest clearances quickly, and more recently we also find that they say, and we will also help maintain law and order around your project, which basically means that we will keep the local population out. If there is any trouble, the law and order machinery will come in and we'll take care of the local. You don't have to worry about it. So that's the kind of context in which this is coming in. So the moment the person is appointed, Nandan Nilekani is appointed to the UID, they create what is called a cabinet committee on the UID. And that cabinet committee then starts giving permissions which have expressly been denied when the project was set up. So the cabinet committee on the UID, now there is I think one of the things that is affecting the way these projects go and the way these relationships are being forged is the deep disrespect for the government. So we say, government is inefficient. We see a lot of the privatization that's happening also going on the same logic. It's a different thing that corporates may be, the corporation that takes over might also be inefficient, but that's treated as privatized inefficiency. That's different. You've got to treat it differently. So you have governments being, the government is inefficient. It can't deal with any of the, it can't collect data properly. Its databases are inaccurate. So, for instance, in the Indian context, we had in the early 90s, we had the voter ID card that was prepared, and all of us have seen this. You'll be, I'll be Mr. somebody, and then you'll have somebody else's face, mugshot on the photograph. Very commonly made errors. So the thing was that these are all imperfect databases. So he said, we'll create our own database. So the cabinet committee on the UID gave him permission to do the first 10 crore, 10 crores, and 10 followed by 7 zeros. I don't know how that translates into 100 million.
100 million.
Okay, 100 million times. 100 million people could be enrolled onto the UID by the UID AI itself. So that is the start where he says, this, we can't wait for and alongside this, actually there was to be a national population register, which derived its authority from the Citizenship Act Amendment in 2003, which was much more xenophobic than any of the other projects that we've had. So for the citizenship register, when they were to collect data, they were then to use the UID AI as the back office because they would be standardizing all these databases. But that's not what happened. Mr. Nilekani walks in, he's a corporate man, he's a man in a hurry. Even before he's got the first permissions from the government, he's already been announcing to the press that he's going to have 600 million people in the database by 2014. Now, where he thought he had that authority from, I don't know. But this we do know that over time, he did acquire that authority. So this is plainly not a democratic way of functioning. So there are multiple interests that have been involved in this. That's the first. The second, in around December of that year, when they start, they say, okay, we have to create a unique identification process. How do we guarantee uniqueness? Because you can change your name, you can have a spelling, if your spelling is a little different somewhere, you change your address, it goes off. So they needed to show how they were different from any other database that exists. And that difference had to be uniqueness. So they said, okay, we're going to use biometrics. Now, what we found interesting was, there are many presumptions that all of us made in the beginning. We thought fingerprints were unique. All of us thought it was unique. All of us meaning all of us working there. We thought in the beginning, maybe it's unique. Maybe they've tested it, maybe they know. Till we found that actually it's never been tested. And nobody really knows. And the second thing is that it changes. Even if it is unique at a certain point, it keeps changing. So, it's like what I am today, I may not be tomorrow because my fingerprints have changed over the years. We also know that elderly people, many of them have no fingerprints that can work because you need valleys and ridges of a certain, which can produce algorithms which can then be redeployed in identifying the person. And that may not happen. So there are, and in when they actually set out what they had started with, they admitted, because they were basically inviting a consultant, a biometrics consultant, in January, February 2010. They said, we need somebody to come in and help us pull this together because in India, we've had no tests at all. We've had a few things that we've done which are encouraging, but we really don't know how it will work in this population. We know that NIST has said that it will be dependent on demographic and environmental factors, which means demographic meaning whether you do manual work, whether you do work with chemicals, what kind of work do you do? And environmental meaning whether it's hot, cold, whether you perspire all the time, whatever. And it's going to depend on this. So if you need to know whether biometrics will work and what biometrics will work, then you need to have a broad-based study, you need some pilots, you need some, you need to know. Well, they decided that they would use biometrics before they knew whether it will work. And that again set our thing, going. Because we said, if you don't even know whether it will work, why are you, what kind of, you do this whole project, someone's going to pillory you tomorrow. How are you taking a risk like this? And it didn't take very long to find the answer to that, because there are three words that were used in relation to this project. And the reason I just say it like this, because I know that these will be replicated in multiple other jurisdictions. This is not going to vanish. And we were already told during the course of the project that, other countries are coming now and they want to know from India, they want to learn from India about how to do their projects. And of course, it was classic because they told us Papua New Guinea was the first. And then we were told there are 4 million people there, which is like 120 crore in India and 4 million here. And they were trying to tell us that it's some kind of a great achievement that we were able to, pass this on. So when they began the process, they said it will be just fingerprints. And in the beginning, they were only talking about enrollment. Then they found that fingerprints alone would not be enough. And that's the last time that this project had independent persons on a committee. They had on a biometrics committee. So they had a committee which said, listen, we've checked it on 25,000 people, and of that 2 to 5% do not have biometrics that will work. So maybe you need to bring in iris, and iris is just emerging from the proprietorial domain. So it might be a good time for you to try it. You'll of course have to test it, whatever. And that's when they issued this notice to the biometrics consultant. So then we said, okay, what is it? So we had a meeting in November 2009, which some of us attended, where Mr. Nilekani and his right hand, left hand, everybody spoke. And they said that he used 3 words at that meeting, which seemed to be the what the whole project was about. And the 3 words were unique, which it may not be, ubiquitous, and universal. And these 3 words have actually helped us understand what the nature of this project is. The point about this project is not biometrics. It's not about biometric identification. It is about biometrics in the sense that it is giving, biometrics is an industry that has been desperately trying to get into civilian spaces because they've been part of the defense establishment for too long. We all know that the computer too came through the defense establishment and how it's become ubiquitous. We know that GPS, for instance, even when the UID project started, GPS was not to be used everywhere because there were multiple layers of security that they had to cross. So they said, for instance, that in cantonment areas where you have the army station, you cannot have any kind of machine that's going to be surveying them. You can't have GPS being used along the coast. You can't have them being used in the mountains. So there were many restrictions, and the GPS manufacturers were saying, listen, we need to get rid of these restrictions if our industry is to grow. So multiple things are about the growth of industry, which is not a bad thing per se, but at the cost very often of what governments very comfortably call national security when we do our protests. But national security seems to vanish when industry has to move, regardless of what it does to the government's own version of what national security is. And so GPS is now often used by Mr. Nilekani to say, GPS was not allowed at all earlier. Now GPS is all over the place. So it's like that. It will all proliferate. Biometrics will proliferate. So the idea of putting biometrics in came only in 2009. In 2006, there was at the meeting that they had, they spoke about ubiquity and universality. And these two have very specific connotations. So the idea was that you should create this identification number for everybody. Now, this identification, which is created for each individual, must be over time used in every transaction that is done by a person. That creates ubiquity. So if you want to open a bank account, you can't do it unless you have a UID number. So it's not just that it will facilitate your opening a bank account, it's that you cannot do it if you don't have if you don't have the number. If you want anything, you want to get a metro card, you want to get a whatever, you want to travel, you want a passport, you want gas cylinders. In India, we've got, that's become the big thing. Well, it's the big gas story. So it's really a bad story. But and we've had multiple stages through which this has come. So ubiquity will mean that every transaction that you have, not only with the state. So the next thing, in fact, what they've been working on is in the medical establishment, where you should be able to go into a hospital if you have a UID number, and this will be the key to your whole data. And whoever is behind that machine will be able to see your whole data, and they control that data. And it is said to be done in your interest. Because you may forget what your problems are, you may forget your ailments, you may not retain your documents properly. And doctors need to know. So, it's like on DNA databasing, which is the other big thing which has been going on, a big push for DNA databasing. There are companies that have come up now which tell you, there is one, for instance, which is give me 4 drops of blood. Earlier, it was also some 600 and odd rupees, but now they've taken that off. They say, just give us 4 drops of blood. and we will store it. And if tomorrow, the kind of scenario that's created, tomorrow you are in an accident where your face gets bashed in and nobody can recognize who you are, we'll be there. We'll identify you. So it's this kind of perpetual peril syndrome that's created to say that they will be protected. So the health is like that. The health sector is being treated like that, where you won't know, you won't remember, it's for your own good and doctors need to know. And anyway, we can't access it without your fingerprint. So if your fingerprint doesn't work, you just don't get your treatment, I presume, but whatever. So it's, and there are manual overrides for everything, but those protections are, you've got to trust somebody. So you trust that technology, you trust the person behind the technology, and you treat technology as value neutral. This idea of ubiquity is running through our system now. It's like you cannot, every day there is a new thing where they say, for instance, in Delhi, early last year, they said you can't get married unless you have a UID number. So there were two people who went in because they'd gone and registered for it. You have to give us a 30-day period. So they'd gone 30 days before then. And when they went in there, they were told that, it's all fine, but I can't get you married unless you go and enroll at least for a UID. So they had to run across to an enrollment booth, enroll, come back with the enrollment slip, then they were allowed to get married. If you want to rent a place, you need to have a UID number. You want to sell, buy, you have to have a UID number. So these are already happening. These are not hypothetical. It's not in the future. That's where we are today. This idea where databases are created and ubiquity makes certain that you're identifiable across databases is the point of this exercise. It is not, incidentally, the biometrics industry is being assisted to get into the civilian domain. Everybody recognizes, and I think, study on the ground shows that anywhere between 10 to 15% at least, even when you begin, biometrics fail. In some places, it's been as high as 40% for authentication purposes. So this cannot be the purpose. When you have ubiquity, then you have universality. Everybody will have to get onto it because willy-nilly, somewhere or the other, like I was saying, if I do nothing else, one day I'll die. And to get the death certificate, I need to have been on that database, otherwise you're not going to get it. So it's a megalomaniacal project. And it has, like Mr. Nilakani constantly kept telling us, all these other IDs that you have just get you access to one thing. If you have a voter ID, you can go and vote. If you have a ration card, you can go and get rations. But if you have a unique ID, that's completely different because what you create is an identity platform on which multiple apps can be developed. I loved it. I loved the idea that, I have this ID on which apps are going to be developed and I have nothing to do with deciding where I want those apps to be developed. When the project began, it was recognized that biometrics and privacy were the two issues. So biometrics, they found a way of circumventing this by simply not answering questions. And actually, if you read all the biometrics reports, they are fascinating because if you see, for instance, what they said on enrollment, they said, plantation workers, people who work in distant areas on mountains and whatnot, if we were to take their samples for purposes of figuring out whether the system will work, it will only complicate the sample. Whereas this is a proof of concept. It was a new kind of meaning for that phrase that they gave us. They said it was basically saying it's a proof of concept study, and therefore we have to prove the concept. We can't disprove it. So we've got to find ways of making. If the population is complex, there's no point in just excluding those who are going to add that complexity and say, well, within this, it's actually all right. So we see that. Then you have authentication studies that were done. So you have, okay, he's Big Dada from, I need to find out after this. Yeah. So you have, the authentication studies that came in. So you have fingerprint authentication. They say that, fingerprints, they took about 50,000 people. And they said 1.87 of them did not have fingerprints that worked. So they said, we drop them from the sample. So you reconstitute your sample on the basis of how many people it works on. Then within that, they said, we've always assumed that the index finger and the thumb work. But they said actually for 45% of the people who they tested it on, these two were not their best fingers. So then they said, after you've enrolled, you go and get a best finger detection test. And that best finger detection test will tell you which your best finger is. Now, it may happen that you don't have a best finger. So then you may have to use two fingers, which will then be, your best finger will be a green finger and your two fingers which work together will be yellow fingers, or you may have red fingers. So it's something like a traffic signal. You may go, you may stop, you may be whatever. We use this report for our, for comic relief, because you can't take a report like this seriously. And very conveniently in two places they say, anyway, there is also iris. Now, iris authentication is even more exciting, their report, because they start with saying iris never changes. And like I never tire of saying, the older you grow, the more interesting it is to think that there is some part of you that is ageless. You're the same through life. And then you find, when you do a little bit of ferreting, you find that actually, why are they saying that it doesn't change? Because there has been no study done so far which showed that it changes. And therefore the assumption, and if there are any economists here, my apologies to them, but it's like an economist's assumption. You can assume anything. You can assume that, the sun, well, maybe it doesn't rise here, I don't know, but it doesn't rise 364 days in a year. So then let's think about what the world will be like. Yeah, sure, you can assume anything you want. So they start with this assumption and then say, therefore, we can depend on this. But actually, the first study that we saw, which was done on this, came here from Notre Dame University, where they showed that within 1 to 3 years, the template changes and the confidence level drops by something like 60%. It's just that it's just emerging into the proprietary domain, and so we don't know. And what we don't know can be converted any which way. You can be an agnostic, you can be an atheist, or you can be a complete believer. And what they're asking is that we should all be complete believers. So this is the context for biometrics. Populations are also very complex. How are you going to get people onto this database? Now you have many people who have some kind of an ID which the registrar may be willing to use. But there are many people who either don't have an ID per se, which I don't think there are too many in India who don't have any ID. You'll have some farmer's card, you'll have a work card, you'll have something or the other, but it has to be accepted by the registrar. The person who is enrolling will be authorized by a registrar, and they'll say, you can accept certain sets of documents from certain people. So if you're doubtful about a person, for example, when slums get demolished in Delhi, the voter ID card stops being a valid document because they say, no, you're not at that address anymore. And the main thing they take from this is the name and the address. So once you have the name and the address, then the rest they are not so worried about. Now you find that the poor, therefore, and the migrant, these are the people who get excluded from many of these because their documents do not work within these systems. But they want everybody databased. For them, universality is the fundamental objective. Ubiquity and universality are their fundamental objectives. So how do you achieve this? They say, all right, so what we do is to create a thing called this introducer. And it's a fascinating concept. Normally, you think that if I have to introduce you, I need to know you. But suppose there is no way that people who are going to be seen as capable of being introducers, according to the registrar, they may not know, they may not know the name and address and whatever of the poor in the, around them. So how are you going to have them introduced? You say, okay, it's all right. Although the primary rule is that it should be like introduction to a bank where you need to know the person, what we will say here is that it's okay if you don't know the person. But the person who's appointing you, the registrar who's appointing you to act as introducer, must know you. I'm sorry, but that's what the documents say, and that's how they've been using it. So you have a remarkable situation where, NGOs have been inducted into this process. And they've been told, just depute somebody to be there. When the person comes in, let them help, fill this up. And they will be the introducer, and they'll give their UID number and their fingerprint to say that they have introduced the person to the system. Completely absurd system. Because I can't go, if I'm a poor person and don't have an ID that's accepted, I can't go and say, this is my name, this is my address, and this is who I am. But somebody who doesn't know me at all will be the person who's going to introduce me into the system, who doesn't know my name, doesn't know my address, and doesn't know anything about me. This system is, we are asked to believe. I mean, there's a lot in terms of faith that this project requires. This system, we are asked to believe, is better than, for instance, a voter ID system where there are so many errors in it. Okay, what did happen, however, was the error started showing very early. In the first instance, it wasn't so bad because it was a man and a woman who went in together, a husband and a wife who went in together. And the man got his UID card with his wife's photograph. So at least he knew who the woman was. I suspect that there wasn't much trouble at home. But in other cases, a little bit later, in 2012, we had the coriander being given a UID number. So, it had the name in Telugu, you had coriander, son of pulao, and then raw mango as the address, and just the district was right. Now, this may just have got lost somewhere and no one would have known about it, except that the UID had been delaying in sending the numbers to people. So, there were a lot of people raising questions saying, what is this? You told us we'll get it in a month, we'll get it in 2 months, we'll get it in 3 months, we've not got it. It's over a year now. So then they said, no, it's because of the postal service. We've given it to them, the postal service is not delivering. So there was a lot of pressure on the postman to deliver on time. And here was this poor postman who knew if he went back with a card in his hand, it's not a card, it's like an intimation letter. If he went back with it, he would be blasted. So he was looking around saying, how do I find this person? And the TV channel got him. So it kind of helped. Sometime later, there was a right to information application, a request, where the UIDAI was forced to admit that there were about 3,500 people who had, who had received these intimations with a dog or a cat or whatever. And they said, how on earth did this happen? And they said, no, must have just picked it off from the computer. It's just an error. What is the kind of check that was put in place? It's highly technological. I mean, what they put in place was this, and it's described in a New Yorker article on Penny called The ID Man, where they say that after these first errors started showing up, they would have these young people sitting in front of a monitor, and every enrollment form would go before them. They would spend about 1 to 2 seconds looking to see, this says man, is that man, does it look like a man? This says 70 years old, but that person looks 22. Okay, that's wrong. Put it aside. So they were doing manual checking, 1 to 2 seconds per enrollment. And according to the New Yorker article, because many of us are not allowed inside those offices, he found that about 300 out of 5,000 had come out in error. At least they suspected that it would be error and they kept it aside.
So the human vetting was not part of PDCL?
No, it was not. In the beginning, it wasn't there. They brought it in after they started seeing the errors. Then, in the so that's the introducer system. Now, why is it that there was the only problem that they anticipated in all of this was they said when people are asked to give their fingerprints, at that time they hadn't thought of iris, there was a committee that was set up on how to sell this it was called Communicating to a Billion. And it was about marketing this idea to people. So they said, make the message simple, give them, like tick boxes on what it is and what it's not. For instance, UID is not a card, it is a number. It is biometrics based, and so you carry it along with you. Things like that. But the basic message was that this is just an identity and it will help everybody. It will simplify your lives. If you just have one identity instead of having to carry around 13 and 14 or not having any at all. And that was a simple message they gave. But in that report, they anticipated that when people are asked to come and give their fingerprints, they will ask, because the only time we think of giving fingerprints is when we are convicts or when we are picked up, and taken into criminal law. So why won't people feel they don't know what it's going to be used for. So they said in that report that since they won't know what it is going to be used for, they might have some hesitation in giving their fingerprints. The fact is that did not happen. The fact is that the moment it was announced that there is this project and you have to go in, you have to give your thing, you have to enroll yourself. Initially, large numbers of people went, and when we went and stood along those queues and to find out why people are enrolling, they said, no, the government is saying that this is one ID, we better go and get it, otherwise tomorrow we won't get our rations. There was a fear of exclusion from systems which were operational. For the middle classes, there were some who said, okay, let me just go get it because they're saying it, might as well do it now. But there were many who didn't go because they just found it a bother and they had enough ID cards with them. So then it became necessary to find ways of bringing different classes of people into the system. And that's where they looked at this and said, okay, what is it that everybody uses and cannot do without? And they said cooking gas. So the poor they had captured through saying that if you want to get your wages under a rural employment guarantee scheme which exists, so if you want to be able to access the food rations, then you need to come in and enroll. But that was not going to bring the middle classes in. So to bring everybody in, they said, all right, we are going to have make it compulsory. So initially in 2011, they said that your cooking gas connection will be at risk unless you go and enroll. And after you've enrolled, every time you get a refill, because it comes in cylinders, every time you get a refill, somebody from the house has to be there to give their fingerprint so that there can be no leakage. Now, the whole thing has been on the basis that the people who are recipients of these services are people who are potentially fraudulent, and therefore they have to be monitored. It is also I must say this, that there was no evidence for any of this. Broadly, we know that there is leakage in the system, but there was no assessment of where the leakage is. If the leakage, for instance, is at the stage where it is procured from a farmer and it's being taken for, to the warehouses for being kept before it's distributed, then it makes no sense to go to the last person. The last mile doesn't make any sense at all. Similarly, if it happens during transit, it doesn't make sense to go to the person who's actually doing the purchase. And what is the extent of loss that was being incurred because of that last mile? There was no assessment of that at all. So for a long time, they had no feasibility study. I mean, this is a project on a mammoth scale, but it had no document backing it. It's one of those astonishing things. I mean, no, I don't think any projects work like this. Until 2012, there was no document of any kind at all. And in 2012, they produced a really interesting piece that was called the feasibility report. And how did that come about? Now, there is a National Institute for Public Finance and Policy. And that institution was given a task of producing it's a report that was done. It's not a report, it's not a document. It was something that they produced. I don't know what to call it. I don't have a name for it. Where they made a number, they said, okay, if this project were to come in and it were to work, and if we were to assume that this is the extent of leakage, and they said we are being very modest about it, we don't have any figures, and therefore we are taking some modest figures. And if this is the extent of leakage, then if we introduce the biometric system and there is a check on what is happening, then we can reduce leakage to the extent of 58%. It is a fabulous figure. If you can reduce leakage to the extent of 58%, on the one hand, you may ask, if it's such a perfect system, what about the other 42%? But even if you were to take this 58%, it's a fabulous figure. So you look at it more carefully, except that whole document, whatever it is based only on assumptions and not even on estimates. Because there is nothing to extrapolate from, there is no data available. So before you know, you don't know what your problem is, you have a solution, and then all problems have to be recast to fit that solution. Because the solution is actually not meant to solve this, but it's meant to do something completely different. This report was challenged by one of the persons who, an economist, a welfare economist in India, and she wrote challenging this report because it did 2-3 things. One, It was completely based on assumptions. The second thing, it did not give authorship. Now, any scientific study or any study where people don't own up to what they are presenting, what is the value of a study of that kind? So I said, why is there no name here at all? And the third thing was equally damning, which is that NIPFP was in an arrangement with the UIDAI, where UIDAI was funding some research on the UIDAI. And this was not declared in that report, in that document. So they said, she asked, what is the value of this? They, of course, they said, no, maybe it is based on assumptions, but we've done it rationally, whatever. They gave them. And then at that stage, they were forced to disclose all their names. And some of them are, they're senior regarded economists. It's not like they were just, but obviously they were not willing to append their name to this because you read the report, you know why. And that they had not declared that UIDAI was involved with them, that they admitted. They said, okay, maybe we should have taken care of this. But that's it. Now, this is being palmed off as the feasibility study. They said, this is the report that we have on feasibility. This is all they have, which adds up to evidence, which can only be, it's a huge cipher. And yet they carry on with this. Now, I'll jump a little bit and just come to the present, which is that when the elections were on the last time, see, they tried multiple things. In the previous government tried multiple things, and they tried introducing it. And when they did it for the gas cylinder, then they had to back off because they found they couldn't get everybody onto the database that fast. Then after they backed off, they reintroduced it in a slightly different way where they said, okay, you'll get your gas cylinders, but you won't get the subsidy on the gas cylinder. What they did not say was that it was actually planned in 3 phases. The first phase where they would determine what the cap on the number of subsidized cylinders would be, which meant that, you might have got it for 12 or 15 cylinders, all the cylinders that you buy in a year. But now it would be capped at 6 or 9 or 12 or whatever the figure would be. And then all these would have the UID number appended to it to get subsidy. And then they would weed out those that they felt did not deserve subsidy. So in any event, you are not going to get it after the first year, but you would be on the database. This database is interesting also because there is no getting out of the database once you're in it. There is no opt-out provision in this. So when the UIDAI was asking, where is the opt-out provision? They said, you can opt out by not opting in. So if you don't enroll, then you opted out. But if I don't enroll, there are many things that I cannot access. I mean, if a person, I don't think everyone is desperate to get married, but if somebody is, then they can't, if they don't have a UID number, then what does that do? And once you're on that database, you can't say, okay, you wanted it for this purpose, the purpose is finished now, remove me from the database. That option simply doesn't exist. What we found over this period of time is that there are multiple places where this databasing is happening. So we have databasing of human beings happening in this. There is a huge proposal on to have what we thought was innocuous in the beginning, which is a land titling bill, which we thought was only about determining title and updating land records, till we found it's nothing of the kind. It is actually a process, and what's also interesting is that this is part of what corporate imagination has been over a period of time. And Mr. Nilekani wrote a book in 2000, which was published in 2008, which captures all this imagination in a chapter called ICT in India. And there's a UID there is the land titling bill, and the purpose is very plain. And you read the provisions of the bill, you find that it's pretty plain. It says that every plot of land in the country will have a unique permanent identification number. I think maybe it's because we've had a severe identity crisis. We are all needing to be unique everywhere. But each plot of land will have this. And then
dimension of the plot?
It doesn't matter. They'll figure that out. See, because the purpose for doing this is to make it marketable. It should be easy to buy. So what do they do in that? Then they say that every claim that is made to interest in any plot of land will have to be accompanied by a unique identification number. So you'll have a unique property identification number, you'll have a unique identification number. Then every person who's claiming any interest in that and gets any title. So there'll be a registrar who will decide whether you're entitled to it or not. And then at regular intervals, you have to declare your interest in that. If there's any change in status, you have to declare the change. If there is any mortgage, if there is any court case, if there is any succession, any change in status to that land, and it has to be reported to the registrar on pain of punishment. What we are seeing in the past 10 years, since 2003, on the National Population Register, they say you have to give accurate information when you're asked to give that information. If you do not, the householder, and for many of us women in India, it's very convenient because women are never accepted as the householders. So it's always the man who's got to pay the fine. But there's a fine of 1,000 rupees that they have to pay, other than providing that information. So that's the first time we noticed that they've started penalizing the population for not divulging information accurately to a state. This didn't exist before. The census allowed you...
Do these have to be passed through Parliament, these kind of provisions, or they just dictated by...
The Citizenship Act is through Parliament, but the penalty clauses and rules which comes from the executive. In fact, the complete takeover by the executive of all of this is remarkable in this.
But there's a provision in the law for penalty or no?
In the rules, not in the law.
It's not in the law.
No. But there is a later law that came in 2008, which was passed through Parliament, which is called the Collection of Statistics Act. And that's bizarre, because in the 1950s, when many countries were getting decolonized, India at that time decided that, we decided on a planned development, planned economy. So there was a certain kind of information that was needed for a state to make its decision on how to plan development. So there are many laws which say that you have to declare how many people are working, how many workers there are in your factory, what your production is, what your capacity is, how much of that is being utilized. And you have to give it to multiple companies, registrar, to the industries. So there are different agencies to which the reporting has to be done. In the 50s, they brought in this idea of a chief statistician and a statistical office. And through that Collection of Statistics Act, they gave authority to that agency to collect information which has already been given to other agencies. It's just that otherwise, so there was a certain respect even for data of this kind which was held by in different silos. And they said, no, the statistician can collect information because then they can give you a profile of what the economy is like. When liberalization came in the 2000s, they said, this has become irrelevant and redundant now. So what do you do if a law becomes redundant? You repeal it. But they said, no, maybe we can change it around and do something else with it. So now they've said that there are many things that we want to know. So every individual, every household, these people were not even part of the earlier legislation. Every individual, every household, every organization and all the rest can now be asked for any information. And there are no boundaries on what kind of information can be asked. So we did meet the chief statistician and ask him, we said, can you, for instance, just go, because you have a population issue in this country, can you go and ask any woman on the street, how many abortions have you had in your life? And he said, technically we can, but we'll never do it. Really? So you did have, in fact, a version of that happening when the state of Andhra Pradesh split into two. You had one state becoming two, so you had Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. And Telangana decided it wanted to know its people. So it said, I'm setting out this questionnaire and you've got to answer all of this. And people felt threatened that they would be excluded from being a part of that state if they did not answer. So you had an influx of people who had gone away to work in many places, rushing back. Some of them from Saudi Arabia and whatnot, they came back because they were worried they will not be treated as citizens of that state. It's totally absurd, but that's the kind of fear that it produces. And they had questions in that which included things like, they said, so that we can deliver services to our people. And then you ask questions like, how many diseases do you have? What kind of disease? You declare it to whoever is coming to you, right? And then what pets do you have? Now, really, they're going to serve our pets?
Oh.
They want to know. And if you don't answer, then you don't have a pet. So it's, there is no logic to the kind of information that's being gathered now, but it's an imagination that's gone wild. And there is no way that we can control this. So under the Collection of Statistics Act, they say that if you don't give that information, there can be a fine or even imprisonment. And then you have the UID where they said, no, this is totally voluntary. We are not doing any, no compulsion at all. But some agency might make it compulsory, in which case you'll have to come to us and enroll. And then the UID has, on record, it's been proven, they've gone from agency to agency, asking them to make it necessary. From the Reserve Bank of India to the Ministry of Petroleum and Chemicals to Department of Financial Services, they've been going from place to place trying to get this compulsory. So what we find we are witnessing is this convergence of the state and the corporation, where, just to give you another segment of this, in 2011, 2011 January end, it might be 11 or 12, Nandan Nilekani is chairperson of a committee which is called the TAG Up Committee. The TAG Up, TAG is Technology Advisory Group, and in the UP, no marks for guessing what U stands for. It is unique. And it's so Technology Advisory Group on unique projects. And the logic of that, what the committee says in that report, is that, government has no ability, it has a lot of data with it, it has no ability to manage that data. So what we will do is to set up what are called national information utilities. These will be private companies acting in the public interest, profit making but not profit maximizing. So government will hand over all the data to these private companies, and these companies will then manage the data, sell back the service to the government and make its own profit from wherever else. So information that we give to a state, thinking that it is a custodian of that information, is going to be handed over for commercial purposes to another agency, which is not answerable in any democratic way to any of us. They don't come within the right to information legislation. They don't come within any of the other answerability provisions. And it's just handed over without asking our permission. So it's just going to be done. This is the kind, and
were there any challenges to it in Supreme Court?
Yeah, so initially, we had to think in terms of when would be a good time to go to the court. Because if you go too early and the court doesn't see what the problem is, they would say, listen, the government is doing something to make things more efficient. Why are you stopping it? Let them carry on. That would just endorse the whole project. So there had to be a time when the time was right.
On what the boundaries should be.
Yeah, and to show that it's a problem, because it needed something really grotesque for a court to be able to see it immediately. And so it was 2013, early 2013, when by then the government was saying that you can't get any service unless you're no gas, no this, no that, no nothing, unless you have a UID number. That was the first time a challenge was taken to the court. And one went to in the meantime, there were a few challenges in the high courts, but they hadn't really progressed very far. The court took a little while to figure out why this was a problem. But then, there are things that work or will help a court understand. By then, in fact, on the day that the argument happened when they issued their order, by then the Maharashtra government, for instance, was saying that nobody is going to get their salaries. The government servants would not get their salaries till they had attached their UID number to their bank account. They said there are ghosts. There are ghosts in that country who are drawing salaries. Maybe the ghosts are working more. I don't know, whatever. But so they said no salaries. Now that wasn't only to the government service. They said judges will not get their salaries in Now I don't know if that's what worked, but I know that after that was said, the mood changed. So what they did then was to issue an order where they said that nobody shall be denied any benefit because they do not have a UID number. Even if it has been declared that you have to have a UID number, no one shall be denied that benefit because they don't have a UID number. So what the government did was carry on with making the demand, but do it, that is, they didn't issue any orders to their departments telling them to stop asking for the UID number. They said, keep asking, go ahead. But there was no order, there was nothing in the order which said you have to rescind that order. So they didn't rescind it. The orders continued. And we would keep getting these requests all the time saying, but the court has said, we'll say, yeah, we're sending you the court order, you don't have to give it. But the local functionaries wouldn't accept it. Then something interesting happened. you have the Central Bureau of Investigation. In 2013 January, there was a horrible case of rape of a child in a school in Goa. And it happened in the toilet of the school. So the police botched up the investigation at the beginning and it was handed over to the Central Bureau of Investigation. Now, when the Central Bureau of Investigation went in, they couldn't find anything either. It was, apart from everything else, it was too late. But they found a random palm print on the wall of the toilet. So they said, we don't know if this has any connection with the crime or not. We don't know any of this, but it will help us to know who this is. So they said, they said, we'll follow the proper procedure. They went to a local magistrate and said, please ask the UID AI to hand over the database, biometric database of all people who have enrolled in Goa. Now the UID AI was panic-ridden. And I mean, this is just my understanding of it. I think one of the reasons that they were so anxious is because their biometric database is, well, not worth much. But whatever. So, if they had to hand it over, it would then reveal that it's never been independently audited. It's now 4 or 5 years. It's never been independently audited. And they then went to the High Court and told the High Court, we can't possibly give them this because we have to protect the privacy of all these people. And they said, there are cases pending in the Supreme Court. The cases pending in the Supreme Court were about the violation of privacy by the UID AI. And they were telling the High Court that, they were banking on the petitions that had been taken to the Supreme Court to say that, this privacy business is so big and we can't hand it over to some strange agency. So then the High Court, and in any event, we can't do this random print because when we do it very carefully. We have to take all, 8 fingers, thumb, iris. Then we are able to deduplicate. That's what we are called. We're all deduplicated people if we went through it. So we can deduplicate and we'll know who the person is. But one random print, we can't get anything out of that. So the High Court said, don't worry about that. If you think you can't do it, there is a Central Forensic Science Laboratory director. He will appoint somebody to check if it's possible or not. Why are you panicking? Then they panicked even further because that was the order of the High Court. They came to the Supreme Court. And I must say the Supreme Court showed a sense of humor that day because they were suitably amused that you're really coming here and talking privacy to us. And we thought you were contesting it, in another case. At that time, they issued an order saying that, of course, no handing over of any databases. But they also said that any compulsion, any mandatoriness that has been put in through an order, that order must be rescinded. That not only was that not done, they've carried on with it, and we've had a change of government since then. Now, with the change of government, before the government came in, during the elections, one of the persons who's minister today, Petrochemicals and Fertilizer Minister, Mr. Anand Kumar, he contested Mr. Nilekani, because Mr. Nilekani at one point said, okay, now I'm getting into Parliament, maybe become Prime Minister, whatever, whatever his ambitions were. And he said that, he stood for elections in Bangalore. And Anand Kumar was his adversary there. And Anand Kumar had won 5 times running. So if he had lost, it would have really been a major challenge. When he went there, he said that when we come to, this is a completely, rotten project. And the Home Ministry has been saying it time and again, information, the Intelligence Bureau has been saying it again and again, that this data is insecure data because you're collecting it in all kinds of ways. And we had Cobra Post, which is a investigative, group of investigative journalists who put those together, who went and saw how enrollments were happening and found that you could pay money and get enrolled, and you could even get biometrics borrowed and put in. Then later, more recently, we had Hanuman, the monkey god, being given a UID. So it's like, the guy who went to enroll for himself found that they were not accepting his information and they were not enrolling him. So he said, okay, I will go as Hanuman. Maybe they will, this is really, it's like faith in multiple ways. So he went as Hanuman and they've captured his photograph. They've taken his biometrics. They've enrolled him as Hanuman, son of Pavan. So it is really a joke, except that it's a bad joke. What it has done, and so what happened after this government came in? Before then, everybody was saying we're going to scrap it and we will not have it, whatever. Soon after this government came in, they had a meeting, and the Home Ministry has been very upset because the National Population Register, that project has just faded out into, very badly. And there are stories within this.
That's the alternative project by Chidambaram.
That's not by Chidambaram. It was actually the NDA which started it in 2003. It's that Chidambaram was asking for it against Nilekani. So it was what they called a turf battle, where finally they decided, the Home Ministry was saying that this is all bad data and we can't take it. And Mr. Nilekani sulked for about 20 days. Then Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who had gone out, came back, and then there was a reconciliation, and they sat in a press conference, and then they said, now we will all be good boys, we will share the country 50-50. Now, if that data is so insecure, what are you sharing 50% of the thing with them for? But that's part of that, the story of absurdity that this project is. When this government came in, they called in the National Population Register, the Census Commissioner, and said, we are handing this over to you now, so you do the work, and the UID will figure out what role to give it. Now that they are there, we'll figure out what role to give it. Because already, there had been a bill which was introduced in 2010 at pressure from a lot of many of us. And that bill had been referred to a parliamentary standing committee, and the parliamentary standing committee had rejected it outright. They had said both the project and the bill should go back to the drawing board. That, of course, was ignored. And the chair of that was a senior member of the BJP, which is in power today. So, all of them were saying no to it. And the Home Minister in this case said that, all right, we will, let's see what role we give them. Then the story goes that Mr. Nilekani went to Mr. Modi, who's now the Prime Minister. And then Mr. Modi changed the decision. And now he has said that, no, we will enroll everybody by 2015. Everyone should be on the database. Everything is going to be linked up with this. So the financial inclusion program is linked up with this. The food is linked. Everything will be linked up with this. And the court has taken the case off the list. So it's been mentioned very recently before the court, saying you've got to hear it because there are things that are happening which need to be heard. And that's where it stands. But that's not all that it has done. So I'll just tell you one other thing that it's done and then stop, which is that like I was saying, you have the land titling bill, which is again creating this whole database. And that database is going to reflect, it's intended to reflect the vulnerabilities attached to every piece of land. So, distress sales, taking over, all these become, so they openly say in that it is for easy marketability. And they also say that the buyer will be indemnified by the state. Now, in many countries, when you have a problem with title and you want to check it and verify it, insurance companies do insure, but it's a commercial transaction. Here, through a law, the state is saying that we are asking everyone to come and give us information and to keep it updated. If they don't do it, we're going to penalize them. You're not going to suffer because you buy. So it's a complete protection. And since it will be a digital database, everybody can see it, and therefore it will be treated as an authentic record. So for many people whose titles are first of all going to be contested on the ground, and you know more about it than any of us here does, people whose titles are not acknowledged, they are not accepted, and therefore you don't know that they have title at all, and that's going to be a problem when it comes to creating that database. To people who now have to expose their vulnerabilities on this database. And to the multiple conflicts that exist on the ground about it's all about development projects and this idea of development where the state has to figure out how it's going to take over land. In all of this, the state now says that the buyer is indemnified by the state. The state then becomes like a insurance company. It's like a security, so financial security agency for the company. So these are multiple kind of things. But there is another one which is, and there are a series of acronyms which have become projects now. So you have Central Monitoring System, CMS, then you have National Intelligence Grid, which is the NAT grid. I mean, the NAT grid is so weird because they say that the job of the NAT grid will be that there will be 11 security agencies, intelligence agencies, which will be fed data real time from 21 databases. And the NAT grid is going to facilitate this. And plainly, the way they intend to do it is by ubiquity of the UID number. Once you have the number in any database, then pulling that data together is not such a big deal. So you have, therefore, January 2009, you start the UID. December 2009, you start the NAT grid. The NAT grid doesn't get even cabinet approval. You forget about having you asked if there's a law, there is no question of a law. It doesn't even get cabinet approval. Keep saying conditional approval because they say this seems like it's going to get all kinds of people into this. So they keep giving only conditional approval, which means they have to keep coming back and saying what they think. At one point, they make a presentation to the cabinet, a PowerPoint presentation. And an RTI applicant goes to them and says, please give me a copy of that PowerPoint presentation, which is only going to explain to me what the project is, not the information that you've collected under the project. Just give me what the project is about. They delay it by 20-25 days and then say, oh, there is an exception in the right to information law, which says that if it is a security issue, then you don't have to give it. And we've just been exempted by a notification that's been issued, so we don't have to give. So National Intelligence Grid takes shelter behind being an intelligence and security agency.
So I understand some of these national security, national issues, but land title, why is it a national centralized thing? I don't get it.
National Intelligence Grid is not at all about a national security
property also title.
No, I'm saying even that is not a security issue. It is about data people and to make people
and everything is made on a national
panoptic.
basis, not on a local basis.
No. So the local has completely got destroyed in this process. So you have people like Nikhil Dey and Aruna Roy, for instance, battling this, saying, listen, you have the whole Panchayati Raj thing. We've been working at the ground level saying that, the local has to have control over what's happening around them. That's, it's all, and centralization to such an extent that every authentication has to go to the UID AI. Because if you look at their strategic vision document, see, this is all meant to become business. That's why they create this thing called the National Information Utility. And if you look at that document, the example, the illustration that they use is the UID AI. And if you look at their strategy overview, you find that they say, governments should fund all of this up to a certain point. So between tag up and this, they say. And when it reaches steady state and it's able to make money on its own, it can move out and become a company on its own. So you fund all the initial thing. You give them the data, you give them the money, you compel people to go in, register all of them, and then you walk away with that database and then make, that's a commercial enterprise because we can efficiently manage this data. So it's a shameless statement that's been made. What I found, but there's another one so you have a DNA profiling bill that started around 2003, 2004. And there is a huge pressure to create this human DNA profiling bill. There was the first draft that came out in 2007, it was revised in 2011 and then in 2012. And then they set up the minister at that time was very uncomfortable with the bill. So first a committee was set up, a privacy committee was set up. And they were, I was also part of that committee, so I watched that whole functioning of that committee. You had everybody, you had the UID AI, you had NAT grid, you had a whole host of the CERTIN, which is the Computer Emergency Reaction Team. So you had and it had a few of us who don't necessarily agree with everything that they say. And the basic reason was the UID project and the human DNA profiling to see what it does in terms of privacy. And a report was produced. Nothing has been done on that report so far. But we've been trying to get those principles to get adopted in different places. Then when the human DNA profiling bill, they tried sending it into Parliament, the minister said, can't do it like this. Please put a committee together. I want to hear on the full bill, not just the privacy aspects. And I was part of that too. So I've just given my report in before I came here. And it's, the thing is that you can say what you want. We are going to get this through. And when you start, so I find today that identification, differently from identity, and control over people's data has multiple meanings. It has political implications which are huge. It has a scientific community that is extremely interested in having this happen. For instance, the DNA profiling bill, the scientific establishment, especially one part of it, is very keen to get into the Human Genome Project and Human Genome Diversity Project, for which you need to have a law which will lend the legitimacy. on the privacy committee, we had the corporate, the NASCOM people in it and others who work with them on it, because they needed it if you're supposed to give them work. So they need certain basic principles, but beyond that, they need to be able to carry on and do whatever they want. So you have executive control, the question that you asked, executive control becoming very strong even in this. You have a human DNA profiling bill. What does it say?
And central government, it seems.
It's central government. But what does it say? It says that, it's central government, but it's basically being propelled by an agency in Hyderabad. And what does it say? It says that that agency in Hyderabad will be the member secretary of a board that's set up. And the kind of people who will have, whose DNA will be databased will be decided by regulation, which is which will be created by this board. The standards will be set by this board. It will be monitored by this board. Multiple databases can be entered into by this board. So it seems for many of these people like it's the time of opportunity to get what you can. And if they do it for the next 5-10 years, then we can worry about the next system that will come in after that. But in the meantime, this is going to, and when Mr. Nilekani came to the US and went and spoke, I think he spoke at Harvard recently. I heard that talk. There wasn't much to, there was nothing to say in the context of that talk. It was again another marketing spiel that went on. So there wasn't much of that. But when he spoke at last year in the World Bank and at the Center for Global Governance, at that time, there were things like the World Bank president, for instance, saying, so what you're telling us is that if there is a woman in Nairobi who is, who goes to operate an ATM and she has to do it through this number, then sitting here in Washington, we may not know what she's, what transaction there is within the ATM thing, but we will know that she is there at that particular point and that she's operating that ATM. And he was excited by this, and I'm like, this is ugly. It's creepy, but it's gross. So that's the kind of vulgarity that's come into our system, apart from the threat that this poses to us. So I see this as more than looking at a project. I think we really need to open up and look at this idea of databasing and the creation of data banks, which can be used for multiple purposes, and the distortion that it's doing of identity. And all these are ambitions that span across time. So these are not, for instance, they said, from the time that a child is born, when a child enters an educational institution till they leave. You had Mr. Nilekani being confronted by students of one of the colleges in Delhi at a public meeting where they said, do you even understand the sociological consequences of having say I get depressed when I'm in school and I go for counseling and that's on record and that's going to be part of my record because the Ministry of Human Resources Development was saying that, we'll have this full record to help employers. So, it's like it's so corporatized, the imagination, that, even if you don't want to, it's very difficult not to vilify this. It's really difficult not to do it. So I'll stop with that. Maybe before we break up, we need to do the final prayer for the new religion and the new